Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the movie Seven. Never thought that I'd really be reviewing this movie, but meh. It's the point where you kind of eventually review everything, or ultimately just kind of get to a point where, um, reasonably there's just some stuff where you're just like, how about I just finally cover this, finally talk about it, or just finally mull over, like some things. So when hearing that ultimately this movie ties into the seven deadly sins, um, immediately what pops into mind is Dante's Inferno, which ultimately they talk about in this movie. I ultimately remember the Dante's Inferno video game that ultimately I had played, and so recently knowing that and kind of watching this, like I was just like, yeah, I know, I remember the video game, and so recently that's kind of my real true tying to this movie. But ultimately knowing also that the seven deadly sins were also used in the Tom Hanks movie Inferno, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where in this movie we have Somerset, who is ultimately Morgan Freeman's character. I ultimately know Morgan Freeman ultimately from doing movies like Kiss the Girls and all these kind of other like really kind of detective kind of movies and stuff like that. Some of All Fears and stuff like that with Ben Affleck. Um, Ultimately, Brad Pitt, of course. Kind of like this movie, you can kind of tell like he's kind of given that same old kind of draw like he kind of did in Fight Club with all the stuff like the things you own end up owning you and all the kind of like the always kind of like the backwards phraseology of things that ultimately is kind of being approaching within this movie. Um, but yeah, I ultimately like the interactions between Somerset and Mills in this movie, which ultimately is Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt. Uh, I also like how whenever they consistently are going into any number of these cases, we have all these kind of side detectives that are there before everyone else is, and ultimately, like Morgan Freeman or Mills is ultimately asking them questions, and ultimately the detectives are like, "Do you seriously think that I would go out of my way to check any number of these things? Like, go f yourself! Like, no, there's no way I'm going to check any number of these things." Or ask these people any number of these questions. Like, no. Like, if anything, like, hey, if you have any curiosity, like, go ahead and, like, answer these things yourself. Um, so, excuse me. So going into this movie, I was kind of fascinated by the way of which that they tend to deliver lines in this movie. Um, or just the way of which that they kind of like paint a picture of any number of these things going on into here. Kind of, they kind of really much kind of like if you can't like smell something, ultimately they'll like describe the smell to you in a numerous amount of ways, and this and that, whatever, what have you. Uh, Ultimately, I just kind of thought that this movie is a little bit dark. You couldn't quite ultimately see everything. Um, I guess ultimately a lot of people break it down of just like, well, yeah, well, wouldn't a lot of it had been too gruesome to see anyways? Like, yeah, but like this movie, like throughout the entire film, it's so dark that it's like, dude, like I would have liked to have seen any number of things in this movie, but like everything is too dark. It's like watching the Ryan Reynolds film Buried half the time, where you can't really see everything that's going on. Um, but anyways, I thought it was interesting the camaraderie that uh, Gwyneth Paltrow's Gwyneth Paltrow's character would have Tracy, ultimately to Somerset, uh, being Mills or Brad Pitt's partner, and like I thought that that was kind of very interesting to ultimately just kind of like tie in Tracy with Mills's partner. But anyways, we have ultimately like I'll cue it up a little bit, or I'll tee it up a little bit. We ultimately have Morgan Freeman's character, who seems to be at the tail end of his police career, and Mills is just kind of like, well, hey, like, I'm the new guy in town, and ultimately I'm just kind of taking whatever I can get, and ultimately trying to really sink my teeth into getting a real legitimate case. And ultimately, uh, we have Morgan and Brad eventually just kind of breaking down this case. We ultimately have it to where it seems that Somerset's character is ultimately saying like this case is gonna like go on forever, and like this case is like too big for any like too big, and ultimately a Brad that is just kind of like chomping at the bit to get to this case, and he's like, dude, I'm gonna wrap this up fairly soon. And ultimately, Morgan's like, no, I don't think so. Like, we have the kind of veteran person that knows better, and we have Brad that's just kind of like, well, like, I think I can get him. Like, we're getting close. We're getting so close. So, let me pause this for a second. I had to regroup there for a second. So, I'm not sure if I got into spoilers yet, but no. So ultimately, we have it to where these two fledgling detectives are just kind of they're chomping at the bit to ultimately get into this really elongated like stretch of serial murders because ultimately, eventually, it gets to the point where Somerset eventually realizes that all these cases are tied together, and it seems like there are some hidden messages or there are some hidden things into this story that eventually Morgan or Somerset is ultimately just kind of picking away at um, to ultimately realize some things. So let's ultimately realize to justifiably go into the spoiler. Because ultimately, yeah, I thought that this movie was fascinating at the end of the way. Not everybody will like this film, but meh, it is what it is. So let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, interestingly enough, we have seemingly Morgan Freeman's character working on his own, and at first, and then we ultimately have Brad Pitt who comes in to ultimately uh, be the new guy in town, and ultimately just being shoved with Morgan Freeman's character. We have it to where Morgan ends up going in, and ultimately, we have it to where this detective is kind of wrapping up this case already for Morgan Freeman, a nice, neat little bow. Ultimately, mentioning that it's a crime of passion. Ultimately, seems like a wife had killed her husband, and ultimately, you have it to where, like Morgan Freeman was like, "Yeah, I could really see all the passion that is all over the walls right now." Ultimately talking about this guy's head. So Morgan Freeman ultimately asks if the kid had seen this shot, and ultimately the detective's like, dude, I didn't ask the kid. I don't care. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably it seems like a very open and shut case. We ultimately have Mills that is coming in to ultimately say, hey, uh, yeah, I'm here. Like, I don't know why I'm here, but I'm here. So we ultimately have it to where Somerset is asking Mills why exactly that he wanted to come here. Because it seemed that he had fought tooth and nail to try to get himself here. So it's like, why is he doing this? Why is he transferring over? And ultimately, like Mills is trying to like duck the question, and ultimately he's just like, well, like I'm kind of like like I'm kind of here in the same way that you're quitting. Like if anything, like I'm just kind of like we're here because we want to do it. Like we're here because we want to. So, but Morgan just is a character that's kind of like, well, yeah, but I just can't get it. Like I can't understand. So, like ultimately, it feels kind of like the feathers of both of them are kind of getting ruffled, because like ultimately, Brad just got there, or Mills just got there, and Somerset is just like, dude, like you're already telling me that like I'm already out the door, and like, dude, like I'm your partner. It's like if I'm gonna work, I'm gonna work. Which ultimately we find that out that Somerset is not like phoning this all in and just like eventually leaving. So we have it to where ultimately the cases start to fall where they may. So the very first case, we have it to where it is glutton. We ultimately have it to where uh, we find a man who seems to be tied to his table, and ultimately he is had his head buried in his pasta of sorts. Ultimately, had been dead for probably 45 minutes. We have a tour. Ultimately, Mills is asking if they checked vitals, and it's like, dude, like I don't think he's coming up for air. I think he's dead. So we ultimately have Mills and Somerset ultimately checking on the body, ultimately to find that there had been several cut marks, ultimately via the shoulder and a lot of other things. Ultimately, they were maybe assessing that at first that maybe this guy just eaten to death, had eaten to death, had eaten too much food and died. Um, but then it seems that his hands and legs were tied, and ultimately that it just seemed that they had noticed that he had a barf bucket of sorts. And so recently they're just kind of finding all kinds of things about this guy. And so it seems that we eventually have it to where they're ruling it as a murder. And so we have it to where eventually when the coroner ends up pulling out some shavings, some plastic shavings, and putting it into some medical thing. We have it to where Morgan Freeman tries to figure out how these where are these plastic things coming from. To ultimately he realizes that it's right in front of the refrigerator, but ultimately he pulls the refrigerator out, and that's the first sign that ultimately it says gluttony or glutton, and ultimately it has some kind of phrase of sorts. Um, Ultimately we have before Somerset ends up going uh and finding the glutton thing on the back of the fridge. Ultimately you have it to where Somerset is talking to his superior and mentioning it's like, dude, like this guy is gonna just go on forever doing these killings, and we're not gonna be able to find him. Like, there's no fingerprints of this guy anywhere. Like, we can't find anything of this guy, and it's just a random killing. So this guy is just gonna go on forever, and like Somerset is trying to get off this case because like this is not just an easy open and shut case, and it's going to take forever to solve. And ultimately, Mills is ultimately chomping at the bit to take this case, but ultimately, Mills' superior is saying like, "No, I think I'm just gonna I'm just gonna have you go and do another case instead." And ultimately, Somerset is ultimately just gonna try to have to figure out like what happened with this fat man. So, and that's ultimately when we find out that Mills is ultimately going to an office that ultimately says greed, and we find out that uh, that a lawyer had been killed in here. Uh, and so reasonably we have it to where reasonably when uh, when eventually Morgan eventually comes back with his sign that ultimately says glutton and now greed, ultimately Morgan is tying the cases together. Ultimately, to say it's like, well, this case is a serial killer and he's killing all these people, and they ultimately eventually have it to where Morgan Freeman ultimately goes back into the place of which that establishes the greed, and ultimately finds a fingerprint that ultimately says the words "help me," which ultimately ties to read or assess another case. So, excuse me. Um, so interestingly enough, there's some like interesting like approaches to this, and so we have a tour eventually they're kind of narrowing it down that it seems to be like parts of the deadly seven deadly sins, and ultimately it seems that there is consistently some methodicalness or some study that seems to go for this killer. And so recently we have it where Morgan is ultimately just like, well, hey, like this guy seems to know a lot about these seven deadly sins, and so ultimately, like he knows a lot about things, because ultimately we push on into sloth. So we ultimately have seemingly a room that has seemingly a ton of the little tree air fresheners, and ultimately we have a guy that has seemingly been stuck in or tied down to a bed for seemingly a year out. Ultimately, I guess to be starved or deprived of any number of things, like to have the most worst torture ever done to him, I guess, conceivable. So ultimately knowing full well that ultimately sloth has to do with laziness or just kind of like just inactivity or just kind of not really being a part of anything. So ultimately we just gotta have a guy that I guess maybe was bedridden and ultimately now is just completely to bedridden to where he is dying upon his bed. So reasonably we find out that via photos that the killer had ultimately just kind of kept this guy like going for a year, like consistently watching over him, consistently uh, like just more just fiendishly just kind of like lurking over him. So eventually we get down to some point to ultimately Mills is ultimately having his wife, or I believe his wife, calling Somerset's character told me ask to go to dinner, and so ultimately I just kind of thought that that was fascinating. Like there's uh, really kind of stuff to ultimately tell us that like Gwen's character Tracy isn't kind of happy with this new place that they are at. Um, ultimately, that Gwyneth Paltrow was like, well, I thought that we'd be able to like lose all kind of tractor pulls and all kinds of other kind of noise or whatever. Like this kind of reminds me of like My Cousin Vinny, where ultimately you would kind of get like the worst of the worst of like sounds always going off to keeping people awake like 24 hours a day. So we ultimately have it to where Somerset ultimately goes to this dinner to like find out that it seems that there is consistently like subways and trains and whatever that ultimately come through there. So ultimately, like we find out that seemingly they Mills and Tracy were to have seen this apartment, but ultimately they're only there for like 5 minutes at a time. And ultimately, they figured out it's just because it's like, well, to avoid all the sounds and noises and whatever, that ultimately they will find out about later. So we ultimately have it uh, to where Morgan makes a joke about like, yeah, like a home where like it vibrates and all kinds of other stuff, to where like Gwen and Morgan are both laughing, and like Brad is ultimately just like, what are you guys laughing about? It's like, come on, like it's not that funny, but it really is. So pushing on, we have it to where at some point, Somerset Superior is ultimately asking him, it's like, dude, like you're not going to be able to retire. It's like, if anything, what are you going to do if you retire? And Somerset's kind of like making up some things to do, like, well, maybe I'll have a barn, and like maybe I'll just be able to do things like I'll be fine and ba 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 ba. Excuse me. And so eventually, Somerset is really just looking at like finishing up his career, and but ultimately, like everybody's just thinking, it's like, dude, you're not gonna be able to retire. You're just gonna enjoy what you're doing, and you're not gonna want to leave. So eventually, we get to a point to where ultimately these guys are otherwise heading to one of their crimes. I believe it's the sloth one. Where ultimately, Mills ultimately asking Somerset, it's like, hey, have you ever like shot anyone, or have you ever been shot, or have you ever pulled out your gun or whatever? We have it to where like Somerset is like ultimately mentioning, it's like, no, I've never had to shoot anybody, and ultimately Mills had shot once, but it wasn't actually at somebody. Um, and ultimately Mills has this story about there was some detective that ultimately he worked with, or that ultimately had gotten like quickly killed, and ultimately like Mills went to the ambulance, or drove away into the ambulance with this guy, but he didn't remember what his name was, and ultimately Somerset was looking at him like, oh my god, like some guy died right in front of you, and like you couldn't even remember who his name was. Uh, Kind of making it so like, well, if Somerset ever died, he probably wouldn't remember what his name was, if he died during the case. Like he's just kind of like he's just kind of like giving Somerset crap, just because it's like, well, hey, you're retiring anyways, so like I guess I could just treat you like garbage. So pushing on, so eventually we get to a point to where it seems to get quasi closer and closer for them to figure out who this guy is. It seems like they are getting ever so much closer. It seems like eventually you have it to where they get into the case called Pride. To ultimately we find that there is seemingly some woman that ultimately is getting her body like picked apart by the killer, and ultimately she ends up cutting off her own nose, and ultimately because we have uh, I guess the killer ultimately kind of like peeling off her skin and ultimately putting bandages on her all over, like mummifying her, and to ultimately she ends up taking a crap ton of sleeping pills to end all this torture. And before all that, eventually we have to where she calls in to the police. So, knowing that she was going to die soon after that. So, but we eventually get it to where to where Somerset makes this conclusion of like, man, this guy has really had to learn a lot of stuff. To ultimately like, hey, like now, like reasonably there are or there has to be uh some books that this guy has like read that really seems very peculiar, like the seven deadly sins. There has to be some kind of red flags that come up when anybody picks out any number of these books. So ultimately we have Somerset, who ultimately goes to some FBI guy that ultimately is a greasy FBI guy. And so we ultimately have it to where I guess the FBI can reasonably and or rationally look up certain books of certain people that have checked out certain books like Paradise Lost or something like that. To where we have it to where some people have library cards, and so recently, eventually, they can get information from these people. So we have it to where, like, funny enough, I liked the fact where ultimately Brad Pitt mentions is like, oh yeah, just because this guy has a library card doesn't make him Yoda, and all this like there's like that kind of funny line. But anyways, we ultimately have it to where we find out that the FBI guy has this John Doe character. And so here's the race to find this John Doe character, ultimately finding out his address, and ultimately need they ultimately want to find this person, and the person ends up finding them, shooting them, and to ultimately they have to mad scramble to try to get this guy. But while getting him, they kind of are circling around to where ultimately Kevin Spacey's character eventually seemingly takes out Brad Pitt's character and almost kills him, but ultimately Kevin Spacey's character lets him go to ultimately run off. So we ultimately have it to where we ultimately have it to where Brad Pitt and ultimately Morgan Freeman ultimately we have it to where Brad wants to just break down this apartment room, but ultimately they don't have probable cause. They ultimately need a warrant. And so, reasonably, you just have Brad Pitt who breaks down the door anyways, and ultimately comes up with probable cause later by getting some homeless person to tell some story. So, excuse me. So we push on. So we have had uh, we have had pride, we have had sloth, we have had gluttony, we have had greed, and there's another one. Um, envy, envy. We have had envy. Um, so now we just have two left. So reasonably, what envy and pride. Uh, but anyways, so we have two left. So we have ultimately, yeah, we have two left because I think we've kind of narrowed it all down now. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out where the fifth one comes from. The yeah. Anyways, so pushing on. We ultimately have it to where they're trying to like, oh my god, like, hey, we're so close. We're kind of like we're getting close to this guy, and he's getting scared. So eventually, we have it to where reasonably Somerset is thinking that at some point this case is going to go cold soon, or ultimately this case is going to go on forever, and ultimately Mills' character is like, no, we're so close. So we have it to where ultimately they're in the police station, and we have Kevin Spacey's character that walks into this police station. Ultimately, is like, detective, detective, detective. Ultimately has blood all over his body, and absolutely nobody in this police station realizes it at all whatsoever. And so, reasonably, you have it to where Mills ultimately scrambles to ultimately have the guy get down, and ultimately the police officer cuffs him. So we are to know about two bodies supposedly, because ultimately the lawyer um, of Kevin Spacey's character, who was ultimately the John Doe, um, ultimately is to tell us it's like, well, hey, like, he's either going to plead insanity, or he's ultimately gonna like full confess that he did it. Um, like, that all depends on if you guys are willing to uh, get through to these next cases. And ultimately, we have to drive out in the middle of nowhere, and ultimately, both Mills and Somerset have to be there for this transaction. So, because ultimately Kevin Spacey admires them. So we ultimately have it to where Mills and Somerset agrees, and ultimately they go out and drive out to here. Where ultimately, uh, Kevin Spacey's character is kind of mentioning how like biblical and whatever that ultimately all he's doing is, and ultimately he's talking that like I'm gonna live forever, like that ultimately like they're gonna study and they're gonna try to figure out like every little thing that I ever did, and like he's relishing in this, and like Brad Pitt is confirming to him, it's like, dude, you're not a messiah. It's like, if anything, you're a movie of the week. Like, you're a T-shirt at best, and so on and so forth. Like Kevin Spacey is talking about how like grandiose that he is, and Brad Pitt is ultimately trying to weigh him down to just be like, no, like, if anything, like, no one's gonna care what you do. Like, between like a couple weeks from now, people are gonna completely forget all about this after your case is done, and so on and so forth. But Kevin Spacey's like, no, like, if anything, like, I'm like, this is gonna be like this is going to be like forever, like etched in stone and whatever, like people will remember all of this. um and ultimately, like, Somerset is like, well, will people remember all the victims? And ultimately, like, John Doe ultimately takes offense to that. It's like, man, all these people like were horrible people. Like, you had a guy that supposedly like, if like nobody wanted to see him eat anything, because ultimately they would lose their appetite, and just kind of mentioning all the stuff that ultimately that John Doe had done. Ultimately talking about the lawyer that was ultimately trying to get a lot of prisoners off, and this and that, and how like great that I'm sure that both these detectives were happy that he got rid of that lawyer. Uh, and so on and so forth, all the people that he ended up killing. Like, how reasonably everybody would have been happy that they would have been gone, and so on and so forth. So, pushing us on to drive all the way to the middle of nowhere, and ultimately, John Doe ultimately wanted them to drive all the way out there during, like, at a certain time. So they drive all the way out here, and ultimately we have it to where seemingly we have to where there's a man that is coming out of the middle of nowhere that is delivering a package. Because ultimately, Kevin Spacey ultimately asks, like, "Hey, like what time is it? Because it matters." And ultimately, you have Somerset that ultimately says that it's like 7:01. So we have some delivery package that is making its way to Somerset, and ultimately it is a interesting package. We have Somerset who's ultimately opening this box, and ultimately he is horrified by, of course, what he sees. We have it to where consistently Mills is ultimately watching over uh, John Doe's character, and ultimately John Doe is talking all kinds of like smack against um, Mills, ultimately talking about that. Hey, like he went and saw his wife because ultimately he found out information about his living arrangements, and so ultimately he went and saw his wife and had and tried to like act like a husband for Tracy, and ultimately had tried to live vicariously through Mills, and ultimately he had took her head, and ultimately we have it to where Somerset is ultimately yelling like, "Throw your gun away!" Like, "Give me your gun!" And this and that. So we ultimately have it to where Morgan runs all his way to Mills, ultimately desperately asking for Mills's gun. Like, throw your gun off to the side, because ultimately we have it to where reasonably we have uh, Mills ultimately telling, like, we ultimately have kind of John Doe telling that's, hey, like, it's your wife that's head that is in the box. And ultimately, Somerset is ultimately just kind of like, hey, yeah, throw the gun away, throw the gun away. So we ultimately have to where Mills is ultimately like, hey, what was in the box? Like, ultimately, this guy is talking about that my wife's head is in this box. Like, there's no way that it's in the box. Like, there's no way. Like, what's in the box? And so, ultimately, like, John Doe is spelling it out of him, like, dude, your wife's head's in the box. Like, I'm telling you right now. Ultimately, like, yeah, like, she was, like, desperately, like, fighting for her life and her child's life. And ultimately, we found out earlier that Morgan Freeman was talking to Gwyneth Paltrow because she had no one else to talk to about having her child. She was kind of very unsure about having her child. And Somerset was ultimately like, well, I had a relationship once, and ultimately, like my wife was, or my girlfriend, or my girl at the time was getting pregnant, and I was kind of very unsure about having a child or not. But ultimately, I kind of regret not going along with it, and so ultimately, we have it to where Somerset was ultimately mentioned to Tracy's character. It's like, well, like, hey, if you get a kid, it's like spoil the crap out of them. Like, ultimately, just like, if anything, you need to be absolutely sure that you want to have this or not, and so on and so forth. So eventually, we get it to where Mills had to find out that Tracy was pregnant via this way, and now, like, we have Brad who not only loses his woman but loses his child also, to where the point of, like, Somerset is basically talking Mills down from shooting John Doe, because ultimately he's just like, dude, like, ultimately, if you shoot him, he wins. Like, ultimately, like, he wants to die. So ultimately you're going to be the wrath. You're going to be the wrath sin. So do not shoot him. Do not kill him. If you shoot him, he wins. And so reasonably we have it to where it just were like Mills is just like, oh God, oh God. It's like he's all kind of, but ultimately it gets to the point where he eventually just pulls the trigger and repetitiously shoots John Doe and then walks away. To where we have it to where uh, California and the guys in the helicopter are all landing. And so, reasonably, kind of just the tail end of this, we have Mills who is just kind of drived off on some police vehicle. And ultimately, Somerset is talking to his superior and ultimately saying, like, well, anything that Mills needs, it's like, just let me know. I'll be there for him. Like, anything that he needs. And ultimately, uh, talking about the kind of wrapping up of this case and ultimately to ask like what Somerset is going to do, or, like where is he going to be, and ultimately he's like I'll be there, like I'll be there, like because ultimately Mills was just kind of thinking of like, well, like I'll be with Somerset. Somerset will ultimately talk about like being with Mills to ultimately kind of like conclude this case for however long that it was going to take, like kind of extend his retirement, and ultimately also you just kind of have him eventually just going like, you know what, like I'll just keep being a detective, like I think there's a reason why I'm like on this case, and I think like Somerset is kind of the more observant person for it's making it made like Mills a better detective. And I think that's the main reason why like Mills would talk about Somerset so much to his wife, um, and so on and so forth. Just kind of like it kind of made Mills like a better detective to have this veteran guy to work with. And so reasonably, I think that was the whole like Mills wanted in some way once they were kind of getting like shaving their chest, ultimately the wires on their chest. Ultimately, just kind of like Mills really wanted them to partner up and stay partners, just because reasonably, um, like they were really like hitting their stride with being partners, and so yeah, there was just something really fascinating about this movie, and eventually how it just kind of unfolds and how it just kind of really just trickles out, like to where you just see like bodies like falling and plopping and whatever. And I apologize for otherwise at some point like uh, maybe leaving things out or whatever, but anyways, yeah, this movie was really interesting to me, and like maybe if it's not exactly visually fascinating at some points, maybe it's just kind of like it's an interesting story that hasn't been done to death or tried to re been reapproached or retried or rebooted or remaked or whatever. um and I just thought that that was good. I thought it was okay that ultimately they were trying to keep this just a one-off movie that they never went back into. So I'm going to get out of here. Reason I feel like there's something missing with this review. Like I forgot some steps here and there, but I thought that this was a fascinating movie. And other than that, I'm gonna fascinate myself out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.